Hello everyone! In this video we are going to pick up right where we left off in the previous one. So up in my address bar, if I visit /search, and if a visitor types in a search phrase and then clicks the submit button, that takes them to this screen with all of the search results. However, at the moment this search results screen is being powered by index.php. And that explains why the headline reads "Welcome to our blog," and all of the content looks like a blog post, even if it is a professor, a program, or event post type. Now, luckily, if your theme folder contains a file named search.php, WordPress will use that to power this results screen instead of index. So let's make our first goal for this lesson to customize this headline text. Okay, so the first step to making this happen is to jump over to our text editor, and within our theme folder, let's create a brand new file, and let's name it search.php. Now, in order to save a ton of typing, why don't we copy and paste over everything from index.php and then just modify what we need to. So I'm going to hop into index, copy everything into my clipboard, and then back in search.php, paste it in. Let's scroll up to the top. So the first thing I'm going to change is the page banner title. Instead of "Welcome to our blog," let's just say search results. Okay, and then for the subtitle, let's say this, pair of quotes, and say, "You searched for," and then I'm going to wrap their search phrase in double quotes. So the HTML code for left-angled double quotes is ampersand LDQUO semicolon. And then I'm just going to place X as a placeholder, but the actual search phrase will go there in just a moment. But then right after it, let's add a right-angled pair of double quotes. So ampersand RDQUO semicolon. Okay, and if I save that and refresh the biology search query URL, cool, so there's our updated header text. And now, instead of the placeholder X, let's work on outputting the actual phrase that a user searched for. So back in our code, where the placeholder X is, I don't want to write simple string text. I want to run a PHP expression or a PHP function. So what I'm going to do is right before the X, we can add in a quote to close out this string of text. And then right after that, we can add a period to add on something new. And then right after the X, we could add on a period and then add an opening quote for the final part of the string that is the double right-angled quote. Okay, so now instead of the X, what we want to do is call a WordPress function named getSearchQuery. And if we go ahead and save that and refresh, cool, we see you searched for biology. And if we go up into the address bar and change it to a search for math, obviously we see that that gets updated. Cool, but before we move on and address formatting for the actual result posts, I first want to touch on a bit of security when it comes to outputting something that is user input. Let me give you a quick example of why security in this context is so important. What if someone malicious went up to the address bar and said that they wanted to search for opening script tag, closing script tag, and then in the middle, maybe they tried to run a bit of JavaScript. So maybe an annoying alert pop-up that says, "Hey." Well, luckily by default, WordPress has got us covered. We see that that string of text was not executed as JavaScript, and instead it just gets output as plain text here. This is because the getSearchQuery function by default provides a bit of escaping, right? It escapes code into simple text instead of HTML or JavaScript that can be executed. If we want to, we can override that default behavior by going inside the parentheses and saying false. So if I save that and still leave this malicious code up in the address bar and refresh, we see that luckily Google Chrome is smart enough and safe enough to go, not today. I'm not even going to let you load the page because something very fishy is going on. Someone probably sent this address to you in an email or spam message, hoping that you would see that the beginning of the URL looks safe, and then that you would just blindly click on the URL, not noticing that the end of it contains malicious JavaScript. This is probably the most popular and basic example of a cross-site scripting attack. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, big deal, Brad, that's not important, right? Because it's as simple as just not specifying false here. Well, that's true. WordPress does provide security against this by default. So here's the reason I went into this whole security topic in the first place. This function works perfectly in the following instance. So just as an example, I'm going to delete this code in about 10 seconds from now, but maybe right above this container div, if I had an input field, type of text, and I wanted to give it a default value of whatever the user had searched for, well, within the quotes, I'm perfectly safe to just echo out the results of get search query. So if I save that and refresh, here's that example input field, and WordPress escaped it and converted the text into a safe string. So long story short, if you just want to use the value that someone typed in as a value for an HTML attribute, you can use this function on its own just like this without any problem. However, and let me delete this sample input here. However, if you just want to output it within a string of HTML, maybe within a headline or a paragraph, the way that WordPress recommends we do that is we call escape HTML and then place get search query within that so that it gets escaped as HTML instead of as a value for an HTML attribute. And then since this function is taking care of escaping or converting the text, within the inner parentheses for this function, we can just say false. Don't worry about escaping it because this function is going to take care of that. Okay, now moving on, if we save that and refresh, perfect. So we've got this malicious code up here and it is not being executed. So we are safe. So now we can go back to pretending that someone is performing a normal search like biology. And our next goal is to control how the resulting posts are getting formatted. So back in our code, within search.php, here is the beginning of our while loop. Then we are calling the post, and then this div named post item is going to be generated once for each result. So basically what we want to do is output different HTML depending on the current post type. Now, there are a lot of different ways we could do this. The first and most obvious way would just be to write an if statement. So say if parentheses curly bracket and say if get post type equals professor. Only if that's the case, then do something. So for example, we could echo and output maybe a heading level 1 that says I am a professor. Okay, so if I save that, cool, so there we see it, and that's only displaying for the Dr. Barks a Lot post because it's the only result that is a professor, right? So the if statement only evaluates to true in this case. So we could just set up a bunch of these if blocks and say if post type is post, if post type is program or event or campus. And that would work just fine, but it's not the cleanest, most concise way of coding things. So instead, let me delete that and let me show you what I propose. So right after this the post line, let's say this. Let's say get template part. You might remember this WordPress function from many lessons ago. So for the first argument, you point towards another file that you want to pull in and use. And many lessons ago, we created a subfolder named template parts. And inside it, we have one file named content-event. So let me show you how I'm going to handle things. For the first argument, I will say go inside the template parts folder and then look for a file that begins with the word content. Only I'm not going to spell it out and say /event because I don't want to hard code it to the event post type. Instead, for our second argument within these parentheses, so comma, and now if I said event or professor, WordPress would try to find a file in that folder named content-professor. So all we need to do to make this dynamic is, instead of a string here with quotes, for the second argument, just say get post type. So now, depending on each result, WordPress will know where to look. As an example, for this first result, since it's a blog post, WordPress would try to pull in a template file named content-post. So let me show you what I'm going to do. This code down here, this div with a class of post item, that's basically the template for a generic post, a blog post. So what I'm going to do is copy this entire div, copy that into my clipboard, or actually cut it into my clipboard, and then within our subfolder of template parts, let's create a brand new file and paste that in. And then the naming of this file is important. Let's name it content-post. Okay, and then let's create another file for the professor post type. So within the template parts folder, just create another new file. Let's save it and name it content-professor.php. And the question is, what should the HTML or PHP code be for professor? Well, there's no sense in reinventing the wheel. So on the front end, in a new tab, if we visit the programs page and then biology, this is the formatting that we can use for a professor post type. So if I want to find the PHP and HTML that creates this format, I can just look within single-program. So in my text editor, single program. And then if we scroll down a bit, here's the custom query to pull in related professors. And right below that, here's another while loop. And here is a list item that will generate that professor card. So I can just copy and paste this list item, copy that, and then back in our brand new content-professor file, just paste that in. Okay, next, let's create a new file for the program post type. So within template parts, let's just create a new file. Let's name it content-program.php. And for program, I'm thinking we can pretty much just copy but adjust and modify the blog post formatting a bit. So to save typing, if we go back into content post, let's copy that, paste it into content program, and we can just get rid of the meta box. We can keep the excerpt, and maybe instead of continue reading, we could say view program. Okay, so if I save that and then be sure to save my overall search.php file, and then on the front end, if I refresh the search results for biology, this is using content-post. This is using content-program. We can see the button has different text. And this is using content-professor. Now I'm noticing there's not much of a vertical gap between these two, and we also don't see a nice subtle border like we do between these two. And this has nothing to do with WordPress, it's just a CSS detail, but to fix that, I'm just going to go into content-professor and maybe wrap this entire list item within an outer div that has a class of post item. Maybe indent this, and then down at the bottom, closing div. Cool, that looks a lot better. So that takes care of 4 of our 6 post types. Why don't we go ahead and create a file for pages and for campuses. So create a new file. Let's name this one content-page.php. And let's use content post as our example. So copy everything from content post, paste it into content page, except pages probably don't need the meta box, so we can get rid of the meta box div. Save that. Okay, and finally, let's create a file for campuses. So within our template parts folder, new file, paste in our clipboard. Campuses don't need a meta box, so let's delete that. And for the View More button, instead of continue reading, let's say View Campus. Okay, and then let's save this file and name it content-campus. Cool, so now if we perform a search for maybe math instead of biology, Here's the math program. We can see the button reads view program. And cool, the event is styled as an event. Now at this point, we are almost complete with our traditional search. There are just two more things I want to cover. So first, what happens if someone searches for something obscure and there are 0 results? Okay, and then once we address that, the other thing I want to do is down at the very bottom of a search results screen, so maybe down here, I think it would be nice to include a search form so you could perform a follow-up search if you wanted to. So back in our code, let's jump into our search.php file. And if a search has 0 results, we just want to output a message that says, no results match that search. And we can make this happen with a simple if statement. So let's do this. In search.php, right before this while loop line, let's add an if statement. For the condition, we can just say have posts. So only if the search query has posts do we want to do something, which we will do here. And then right after the closing curly bracket, we can say else, otherwise do this. So if the search does have results, then we just want to run our while loop. So I'm just going to move the while loop as well as the paginate links. I'm just going to cut that into the curly brackets for if this condition is true. So instead of X, paste that in. And since we are no longer mingling HTML with PHP, we don't need to exit out of PHP here, which means we don't need to reopen PHP here. Okay, and then for the else, we can just echo out maybe a heading level 2 that reads, no results match that search. And just for styling, let's give the H2 a class of headline and headline dash dash small dash plus. All right, so if I save that and refresh the math results screen, we still see our results, but if I search for something super obscure, perfect. No results match that search. Okay, and then the last thing I want to do is add in the search form to perform a new search down here. And I want it to display whether there are results or not. So back in search.php, right after this block of PHP, instead of typing out a bunch of HTML to create a form, we can just copy and paste the form that we wrote in our previous lesson. So if I jump into page-search and scroll to the bottom, let's just copy this form element. And then back in search.php, you could technically just paste that in here, but that would be duplicating your code, which I'm not a fan of. Instead, let me show you what we can do. Within the root of our theme folder, if we create a brand new file and paste in our clipboard there, and then name this file, and the name is super important, search form. No spaces, all lowercase. Okay, now back in search.php, WordPress has a special function designed to look for that exact file name of search form. So maybe right below the curly brackets for the else, we can just say get search form. So if I save that and refresh the search results, perfect. So now I could search for biology and we're in business. And just to reduce duplicate code, let's be sure to go back into page-search where we just copied the form from, and let's delete the HTML for the form, and in its place, use PHP to say get search form. Cool, so then the code only needs to live in that one location. And that's going to bring this lesson to a close. You might have noticed that this traditional search doesn't pull in results based on relationships like our overlay search does. Now, we are not going to take the time to modify this traditional search because I feel like that would be ultra repetitive and way too similar to what we just did in the last chapter where we searched by relationship for our overlay search. But don't worry, if you are indeed curious about how to set up custom search logic using traditional non-JavaScript searches that rely on URL queries, you'll be happy to know that at the very end of the course, in an extra credit section, I point you in the right direction to make that happen. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We will cross that bridge as we come to it. So let's keep things rolling, and I will see you in the next lesson.